Forget the stiff portraits and the polite tea sipping you see in period dramas. Because honestly, the Regency era was a fever dream of bizarre social flexes and questionable hygiene. Sure, the London season was all about hunting for a spouse, but the rest of the year? Spent in massive country estates where the nobility behaved like bored teenagers with unlimited budgets. We're talking about a world where your social status was literally determined by how many hundreds of acres of grass you could afford to keep perfectly manicured, just for the sake of looking rich. It was intense boredom mixed with extreme luxury, where the rules of etiquette were so rigid they practically functioned as a contact sport for the elite. And if you think modern influencers are obsessed with their image, wait until you see the lengths a 19th century duke would go to just to prove he was better than his neighbors. The Regency off-season wasn't a vacation. It was a high-stakes performance of wealth where even your bathroom habits could be a political statement. When London's heat became unbearable, the upper crust fled to their ancestral seats to manage mini-empires and pursue hobbies that would make a modern billionaire blush. From turning their homes into public museums to using Napoleon's face for target practice, in the most literal sense, their daily lives were a mix of the sophisticated and the straight-up absurd. You might picture them reading poetry by a window, but the reality involved aggressive networking, massive debt, and a very specific type of outdoor gaming that was basically war with mallets. So let's peel back the velvet curtains and look at the 22 weirdest things these people actually did when they weren't busy dancing at Almack's. High society families in 1805 didn't just use standard ceramic chamber pots in the middle of the night. No, they commissioned custom porcelain pieces featuring the face of Napoleon Bonaparte inside the bowl, so they could literally disrespect the French emperor on a nightly basis. The ultimate patriotic power move during the Napoleonic Wars, turning a basic biological necessity into a nightly insult against England's greatest military rival. Most people assume grand estates like Chatsworth were private fortresses, but actually the nobility ran them like proto-theme parks for anyone with a decent coat. Complete strangers could simply show up at a duke's front door and request a guided tour of the family's private living quarters and art galleries. Owners even printed official guidebooks for these random tourists, essentially turning their private sanctuary into a public museum, just to flex their massive collection of statues. Managing a Regency estate was less about gardening and more about running a sovereign nation across 1,000 acres of ancestral territory. The lord of the manor wasn't just a landlord. He was responsible for the literal survival of hundreds of tenants, food, clothing, housing, all of it. If the local farmers went hungry in 1812, it wasn't just a tragedy. It was a massive stain on the nobleman's reputation, suggesting he was, quite simply, a failure. When the British elite wanted to travel in the early 1800s, they found themselves trapped on their own island, because Napoleon had effectively closed off continental Europe. So young aristocrats swapped the classic grand tour of Rome for the rugged, rainy Scottish Highlands or the Welsh mountains. What started as a military necessity quickly became a trendy domestic tourism boom, turning remote villages into hotspots for the rich and bored. Indoor plumbing was almost non-existent in the finest mansions of 1810, meaning even a duchess had to rely on a hole in the ground or a pot. While a few avant-garde estates experimented with early water closets, the vast majority of the nobility spent their mornings waiting for servants to carry away their waste. A strange paradox. A man could own a Rubens painting worth a fortune and still not have a flushing toilet. House parties in the countryside were essentially social kidnappings, where guests were expected to stay for days, sometimes weeks, at a time. The dirt roads of 1815 were treacherous, travel was slow, and you couldn't just drop by for a quick dinner and leave. Once you arrived at a remote manor, you were a captive audience for the host's matchmaking schemes or political manipulations until the carriage was finally ready. And here's the thing. The cost of hosting one of these house parties was so astronomical that families would often live in total poverty for months just to afford 1 week of luxury. Hosts would buy entire new sets of uniforms for their staff and hire temporary armies of servants just to impress a single visiting earl. It was a cycle of fake it till you make it that frequently ended with the family drowning in massive, soul-crushing debt. Visiting guests were expected to carry a literal bag of cash just to tip the host's staff before they were allowed to leave. These veils were mandatory. Failing to pay everyone from the butler to the stable boy was a social death sentence. So even a free stay at a friend's castle could cost a junior officer his entire monthly salary in gratuities. While the men were out shooting things, Regency women were obsessed with a high-intensity lawn game called shuttlecock, essentially a primitive version of tennis. They'd spend hours batting a feathered projectile back and forth across the grass while wearing restrictive corsets and heavy silk gowns. It was one of the few socially acceptable ways for a noblewoman to actually sweat in public without losing her status as a lady. If you wanted to prove you were truly elite in 1818, you didn't just build a house. You built a glass conservatory to grow exotic fruits. These massive glass structures were the ultimate status symbol, proving you had the money to waste on heating an entire room just for plants. Owning a pineapple grown in the English countryside was the 19th century equivalent of owning a private jet, pure, unadulterated wealth. Noblemen in the Regency era were frequently obsessed with pedestrianism, basically a high-stakes version of competitive power walking for massive gambling purses. Famous aristocrats would bet thousands of pounds on whether a man could walk 1,000 miles in 1,000 consecutive hours on a dusty country road. It turned a basic human movement into a spectator sport where the elite could lose their family fortune on a guy's calf muscles. Before croquet took over the world, the nobility played an incredibly loud and aggressive game called pall mall on long paved alleys. Players used heavy mallets to whack a wooden ball through a high hoop suspended over the path, often with enough force to cause actual injury. The game was so popular, it gave its name to one of London's most famous streets, though the country version was far more chaotic. The gentleman's study wasn't just a place for reading. It was the high-tech command center for a massive agricultural corporation. A lord spent his summer mornings meeting with a steward to review ledger books and calculate rent owed by hundreds of tenant farmers. If the numbers didn't add up in 1814, the noble family risked losing their ancestral lands to the burgeoning merchant class who were hungry for power. Reading poetry wasn't a solitary act of relaxation. It was a competitive performance piece held in the drawing room after a heavy dinner. Nobility would take turns reciting long, complex verses from Lord Byron or Wordsworth to prove their intellectual superiority. A single stumble over a stanza could make you the laughingstock of the county, proving your education was as flimsy as your reputation. Archery was the only weaponized sport considered perfectly graceful for both men and women to practice together in the garden. It allowed for a very specific type of supervised flirting, where a man could correct a lady's grip on a bow without causing a scandal. In the summer of 1811, a well-placed arrow was often just an excuse to catch the eye of a wealthy suitor from across the lawn. To escape the boredom of the countryside, the nobility flocked to spa towns like Bath to drink warm, mineral-rich water that tasted like old pennies. They believed it could cure everything from gout to a broken heart, fueling a massive industry of public bathing and social climbing. And you weren't just there for the health benefits, you were there to see who else was desperate enough to drink the sludge. Seaside resorts became the new frontier of Regency fashion, where the elite used bathing machines to enter the ocean in total secrecy. These were wooden huts on wheels, rolled into the waves, so a lady could jump into the water without anyone seeing her wet skin. Bizarre and cumbersome, but privacy was the most expensive commodity a noble could buy. Every Regency manor had a drawing room, and no, it wasn't for art. It was literally the room where women would withdraw after dinner. While the men stayed behind to drink port and talk politics, the women were segregated to drink tea and manage the family's social calendar. This ritualized separation was the backbone of Regency social engineering, ensuring power was divided strictly by gender and beverage choice. The obsession with ancestral seats meant a nobleman couldn't actually sell his house, even if he was completely broke and starving. These estates were often entailed, meaning they had to pass to the next male heir intact, regardless of the current owner's financial disasters. It created a whole class of land-rich, cash-poor aristocrats living in crumbling palaces while struggling to pay for a single loaf of bread. Parlor games like Blind Man's Buff were surprisingly violent affairs where blindfolded aristocrats stumbled around expensive furniture trying to catch their friends. It was a rare moment where the strict rules of physical contact were suspended, allowing for a chaotic and often bruised version of social interaction. In a world of constant bowing and curtsying, being tackled by a duke in a blindfold was the height of rural entertainment. Noblemen often spent their summer nights obsessively writing letters to maintain their influence in London while Parliament was in recess. A single letter could take days to arrive by mail coach, making every word a calculated move in a long-distance game of social chess. Stop writing in 1813, and you were effectively dead to society. Your friends would assume you'd lost your money or your mind. And finally, the most elite families kept actual breweries inside their own homes to ensure their staff and guests never had to drink common, low-quality ale. These private brew houses produced thousands of gallons of beer annually, often with secret family recipes guarded more closely than the crown jewels. It meant that even in the middle of nowhere, a Regency earl could guarantee his guests were drinking the most exclusive alcohol in the British Empire